Karl, we're talking about deeply conservative tendencies in Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries. Isn't this going to hamper progress towards modern pluralist societies?
As I say, we're coming at the back of a failure, let's admit it, which most Arab secularists haven't admitted to themselves yet, of big, grand utopian projects that went nowhere and in many cases actually led to the reverse results, so led to societies declining and failing to succeed on development and economic and social aspects. So there is a moment that what is required at the moment is a clear vision of the future that can build on this political potential. And if you were then to conduct that same survey, say, in 5 years, the answers that you will get are different. So, for example, you look at a country like the UK. If you were to ask about the death penalty, conduct a survey about the death penalty in the aftermath of a particularly horrific crime, you probably get 70-80%. Doesn't mean actually 80% of the population supports capital punishment in this country. So I would be skeptical about that. But I think the more important point for me is to put all of this again in context and try to separate this understanding, again, this conflation of talking about this Islamists with a broad brush as if they were the same people who kind of 1400 years ago came out of the Arabian Peninsula and expanded. History has moved on, and what we are seeing are parties that are specifically concerned with this, as Carool described it, a socially conservative outlook that's trying to find its place in the modern world.
I want to second that. I think it's important to note that indeed frustration is often behind support for what we would consider extremist or overly religious parties. It's a protest vote in first instance. And indeed people siding or suggesting the death penalty, especially in crisis situations, is not surprising. And a lot of these penalties are probably directed towards the outgoing powers. The very fact that you brought up Pakistan is illustrative of that as well, that the support there is so great maybe for these extreme ways of restoring law and order, is because Pakistan is on the verge of being a failed state. And I think we haven't reached that stage yet in countries like Egypt or Tunisia. There's a great degree of frustration among these people, and they want a chance to try something else. And for the directions, I think we should at the moment still look outside of the Arab world. The way not to go is Pakistan. The sort of inspiring examples is the formulas now being tested in Turkey. And let's not forget Indonesia. It's far away, but it's the largest Muslim nation state in the world. And it has managed to reconcile Islamic, not Islamist, activism with a constitution that is almost as secular as the one in Turkey.
I want to follow that point for a moment, and I just want to remember that we're speaking today almost 1 year after the Tunisian street vendor Mohamed Bouazizi set himself ablaze, kickstarting this year of revolutions that we've seen. Now, in Tunisia, their Islamist party Nahda looks towards coalition with secularists. I want to put this one over to you, Georgy. Is that a promising model for the Middle East to emulate?
Well, of course. There is no other way out because they won't have overall majority. Nobody knows what's going to happen in Libya, of course, and especially in Syria. We can now be talking only about Tunisia and Egypt, and there is no way to foresee the outcome of the armed struggle in Syria, for instance. I think things will get worse before they get better as regards Syria. But the main point is Egypt, and I believe there's going to be a coalition between Muslim Brotherhood and traditional secular parties. But the situation in Egypt differs from that of Tunisia in the sense that there is a powerful another player, the army which controls at least 30% of the economy. And the army will never allow the Muslim Brothers, to say nothing of Salafis, to take over, because it will mean a real disaster for the generals. So what we're going to see, the worst case scenario would be the Algerian scenario, when the Islamists will try to take over and the generals will drive them underground and this kind of civil war begins.
I want to take Georgy's point about whether or not the generals are going to relinquish power. We've obviously all been shocked by the photo that's been going around the internet the last couple of days of soldiers beating and kicking a woman protester on the ground and then lifting up her clothing to expose her underwear. Shocking here in London, of course, but particularly shocking in Cairo. Karl, are you concerned that the military council is going to be able to use the threat of the gaining influence of Islamists to justify not handing power to civilian rule?
Obviously, that's the broader framework for what the military council, the ruling military council, is kind of trying to do. But let's not sort of exaggerate its powers, so to speak, because it as well was taken by surprise by what happened in January. And looking back at it now, the scenario obviously was sacrificing Mubarak in order to retain that power. But the army's power isn't detached from how it's practiced on an everyday basis, and specifically in those extremes that we have seen, such as the woman who was being attacked in front of the cameras. That is an extreme that actually talks about a loss of authority rather than about a power that it's comfortable with its control over authority. The more and more frequent images like that people will see, I predict a kind of erosion of the army's ability to kind of use this repression. Repression works if you use it in the short term. In the long term, people will start to challenge that. Now, you talk to activists in Egypt of kind of the more secularist persuasions, and they are feeling that they are being attacked on that front, but also on the battle for support among the public, and they have the sense that there is an overwhelming majority that just wants kind of stability to be brought back. But that kind of unknown factor will not be appeased by these images of repression. So what I'm trying to say is the military is kind of buying time and trying to project this image of kind of control and ability to transition into some sort of coalition that features the Muslim Brotherhood and all of that. But what we ignore when we write the scenario for Egypt for the next few years based purely on those facts is the big unknown which was unleashed at the beginning of the year, the power of the people to transform and challenge authority. And this is where I think Georgy is completely mistaken in dismissing that element, because let's remember, it's what kick-started everything.
I'm going to let Georgy come back on that in a minute, but first of all, Carool.
We cannot ignore the factor of the military and political life in many parts of the Muslim world. And the atrocities we have seen over the weekend are just an indication of the despair of SCAF, which is now showing its true colors and just trying to...
Can you just clarify what SCAF is?
That's the military junta, as I would start to call it now, that is controlling Egypt. But let's not forget that the other two examples I gave earlier, Turkey and Indonesia, have a tradition of decades and decades of military control, and in both instances they have been sent back to the barracks. Karl brought up a very important point, and it is a massive challenge. The Arab Spring was started by this amorphous group of disaffected middle-class citizens, I would say. And the challenge they face is indeed to come up with a structural agenda for the future. But it is definitely something now that the middle classes are gaining critical mass demographically, economically, and politically now in the Middle East, that we're in for a tectonic shift. But it's not going to be pretty for decades to come.
I'm going to put that one over to you, Georgy. I'd also be interested in getting your opinion about how you see the political map of the Middle East changing over the next few months. Any developments that you'd predict in some of the countries that are still in the thralls of revolution, Libya, Syria, Yemen perhaps?
Well, I am much more optimistic about Libya now, after Gaddafi rule is over, than about Syria. The most trouble area now is, I believe, Syria, and I don't know the outcome of this, because there's complete deadlock. Nobody knows what to do about it. The Western military intervention is out of the question, I believe, but I see no way that the local forces can come to a consensus, an agreement, a dialogue, as our Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Russian minister, has been proposing now, that dialogue and compromise. I don't see any compromise in the civil war. So I think that the most dangerous point is now, of course, Syria. And if there is something really catastrophic in Syria, it will reflect in Lebanon, of course, and maybe in some way as regards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because basically, if the dust settles down, if everything is more or less quiet in a few months' time, then the really huge question will arise, that of a relationship between the Jews and Arabs in Palestine. And you see, 2 days ago, the leader of the Hamas said that there is no way, only under the resistance, and he called for the creation of an Arab army, overall Arab armies to rescue Palestine from the Jews. So I believe that everything is more or less calm and quiet. Then the question of Arab-Israeli conflict will come to the fore, and this is a real impasse, because in the last few decades, I believe, never has the situation looked so pessimistic as it is now.
Syria is indeed a country where the transition is probably going to show its ugliest face. On the other hand, I think it also has a large potential of coming up with a new scenario for the future, much better than Libya, where maybe it was clearly shown how feeble Gaddafi's hold on power was. But it shows also exactly how entrenched and how strong tribalism still is in that country. And that doesn't bode very well for coming up with a political system that is comfortable with modernity.
Karl, any final comments from you?
I would like to pick up on a point that I didn't talk about before, which is the point about the alliance, if you like, the coalition in Tunisia, and leaving space. So it's kind of almost an act of charity by the Islamists to leave space for more secular politicians, and, for example, allowing the president to be a secularist. That's the kind of the happy phase now, before the real conflict of interest starts. And if we kind of ignore that, it's a kind of not necessarily a warning, but for an invitation for a more rigorous confrontation of ideas, and that will come in the coming few years. So past this phase, I think Tunisia can have a real battlefield of political ideas, and then the onus is on those secularist parties whether they can respond to those ideas promoted by Nahda party and other Islamist parties, and come up with agendas that can really represent a tangible future for Tunisians that talks about dignity and economic development and prosperity and all universal demands that everybody would want. Now, as regards the other point that I would like to talk about, which is Syria, where we really have a serious predicament, but I think it's a window to discuss about one very serious feature of some of the Arab uprisings that we've witnessed this year, is because of this lack of very clear political and ideological framework that those uprisings represent. We don't have any ideas that will reassure the majority of the population that does not support the regime, but at the same time is afraid of supporting the uprising. They are not being given any reassurances, neither on a practical level, but more importantly at a broad visionary level. What is your future going to be? What are you being offered? They're clinging at the moment to the illusion of stability that the order in Syria have maintained for decades, but obviously that has been exposed. So I think I'm not pessimistic, but I think any illusion that help will come from outside is completely wrong. But what is needed, a very clear political agenda for change, without which we're looking at a very long stalemate. And if I may say, that also applies to most of the other Arab countries, if not all.
That was Karl Sharro, a commentator on Middle East issues. I was also joined by Dr Carool Kersten, a theology professor from King's College London, and over the phone from Moscow by Georgy Mirsky, a research fellow from the Russian Academy of Sciences.